Hey guys, I'm back with another video here, from a blank piece of paper to something cool at the end. At least I thought it was cool, but I guess we'll see here. So I'm just laying down some gross lines here on a multimedia paper. I don't know what it is, maybe 70 pound, 80 pound paper. Um, Relatively thin stock here, but it's got a lot of tooth to it, and because it has a lot of tooth, I'm using a 2H pencil, a nice hard lead. I like to typically draw on recycled stock, which is um, pretty smooth, as well as Bristol board, which is pretty smooth as well. So on those papers, I'll use a bit of a heavier lead because it doesn't tend to smudge as much as it does when you have a toothier paper. And I don't like smudging. It just drives me crazy. I spend more time erasing around the image than I do working on the image itself. Um, anyway, so here I'm going to do a fun Darth Maul sketch. I saw some images on Google Images, just kind of looking around for some inspiration, and I was like, I'm going to do something fun here, so this is what I decided to do. So you can see here, I'm just laying down my own guidelines and just kind of illustrating as I go, fixing things as I go, and not worrying about the details, because, man, if you sit there worrying about the details at this stage of the artwork, everything you draw ends up winding up being crooked, and because you're just not looking at the thing holistically, which I feel that you have to do at this stage. So yeah, just gross shapes, and you'll see me every once in a while kind of use my pencil as a ruler. I'll measure one side of something with, kind of slide my thumb over the pencil, and using that to measure the other piece, like in another eyeball or the other side of the nose, or things like that, maybe an ear. So yeah, we're in the middle of Colorado. It's the middle of March here, and really isn't much to do outside the house these days. They don't really have us on a quarantine or anything like that, but they're advising that we don't leave the house, and businesses are mostly shut down. My own business is shut down for a month, starting yesterday. So there's not much to do but hang out with family and, work during the day and draw in my free time. It's snowing out at the moment, so there's no yard work to be done. Can't do anything. So yeah, you're going to watch me draw. Again, just laying out some basic shapes, not worrying about the details of the teeth or anything like that at this point. I'm getting some of those horns. And I'm making 45-degree guidelines just so I can kind of line up the horns from left to right. Never make enough guidelines. They always come off. So once I get this to a good point, typically what I do is I'll use a red color erase pencil to kind of go over some of my light lines, especially if I'm going to do something that's heavy in red, because the pencil marks tend to smudge into the red, and it kind of gives me a haze around the red marker, and it drives me crazy a little bit. So you can see I'm erasing some of that extra lead here to throw my color erase red pencil on top of it. But I don't know, I realized after a couple horns here that it's just a waste of time. I just want to ink this thing and see if I can keep this thing under a couple hours, which I ended up doing. So this right here is my Zebra brush pen. I'm a huge fan of brush pens. I used to only do work in mechanical pen, but the more I do this, the more I like the varying line width as I illustrate. So Zebra pen is a disposable pen that comes out of Japan. There's 3 different sizes. There's a medium, a small, and a large. And I typically like a pen that has a soft tip, not too soft. I want to be able to control my fine details with it. And I find that the small tip pen is just a little bit too stiff, so I don't get a nice varying line width. And I find that the largest pen is just a little bit too soft, and I don't get enough detail. So this medium pen just works great for me. And I illustrate usually on a pretty small surface, either sketch cards or this 5.5 by 8.5 sheet. So the medium just seems to work great for me. If it was a lot bigger of a piece, I'd probably use the larger pen so my line width a little bit thicker, but yeah, I think this is perfect for me. I'm going in there, I forgot a couple pieces on the nose. I noticed that he's got some little diamond shapes on his nose. I'm going back in there drawing that, of course with guidelines, because I'm a big fan of guidelines. And as I'm inking here, I'm just not being super detailed. I think the piece looks a little bit more organic, especially when you're drawing a face or something like that. I think just let the pen tip kind of do its work for you. You know, just pull it and push it, and don't go so slow, because when you go so slow, it makes the lines look too mechanical, or I just don't like the look of it. I just like to be fast. I think it flows better that way. Now, of course, this is just my technique. Everybody's got a different technique, and it's totally fine. Another thing to take note is you'll notice that I like to ink from bottom right-hand side of the paper up towards the left. I mean, I'm kind of moving around a little bit here, but that's usually how I do it. And some people have asked me, like, why do you do that? That's kind of against the rules as far as inking, because my right hand would technically be smudging everything that I'm working up towards. But the short answer to that is because of tattoo work. Typically, at least the way I was trained, when you do tattoo work, you want to start at the bottom of the stencil. This way your hand isn't wiping off the stencil as you work. If I was to ink on a tattoo from the top left working downwards, my right hand would be smudging all my guide work out. So it's just an old habit that I can't seem to kill. But yeah, so that's why I do that. And it was kind of strange, but it works for me, only because I'm too stubborn to learn how to do it the right way. But it works. And here, just starting to finish up, get those teeth done, and work on these two little handlebars here at the bottom. That left side just gave me a lot of problems, so I had to redraw it a few more times before I started inking, and eventually just said that's what it's going to look like. There we go. Now it's time to start getting some of those colors in. Now, I realized after I had done this that it was kind of silly to start with the dark colors first, because when you're using Copic markers, the lighter colors will pick up the dark colors. So as I'm coloring all this, the black areas here, and getting that all done, I went to the red areas, and the red was starting to pick up the black and smudging it into the red. And I don't know why I decided to do the black first, but I did, and it turned out okay. But typically you should start with the light colors first, the light areas first. This way it's not pulling the dark into the light. Just kind of a rule of thumb with Copics. I started off with a N4. I used the neutral colors of the black scale, and you can see on the right side of the image, but our left side, the N4 was running out of ink, so I jumped to an N3, and now I'm somewhere maybe an N5 or 6 at this point. My light source is going to come from the left, our left, right side of the image. So I'm just going to block this stuff out. It always looks funny when you're blocking, but in my mind I know where I'm going to go. I'm just setting up some of that dark value. It's always unnerving when you lay down a bunch of ink lines and then you go over it with a real dark Copic and you say, man, I spent so much time inking that, but now you can't see it. But as I move forward into the highlighting stage, I'll bring some of that stuff back out. When I use Copics, I typically like to use Bristol board because it sits on top of the paper a little bit longer, so it's easier to smudge or easier to blend. With a toothier paper, it kind of absorbs into the tooth, and you can't do that as well. But if you're going to use multimedia, which is, adding some pencil on top and things like that, you don't want it too smooth because there's no tooth to keep the waxy pencil on. So this stuff just seems to work pretty well for both mediums together. And now that I'm mostly done blocking the black, I'm starting to add in some detail here as far as, different variations in shade. Just trying to show where I think the light would be hitting and where the shadows would be cast. I'm starting to deepen those crevices and, try to think 3D and try to think, if I have a brow bone, what would the light be doing if it's coming from the top left? How would it be affecting the shadow underneath, and what direction would that shadow be cast? And, to me, when you're rendering a piece, that is the important stuff. That is where people that don't understand the technique or care about the technique as much, that's where the illusion will be set in their eyes. They, when we're looking at something, we see light, dark, highlights and shade, and as an artist, you can use and manipulate those things to trick people's eyes to make it feel like it's, in 3 dimensions. And the art behind it is how are you casting those shadows? If the light is coming, from 12 o'clock noon high, and then the shadows would be elongating towards 6. Obviously, if they're coming from 10:30 or 10 o'clock, then they're going to be casting towards 5. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind as you're working at all times, because the illusion can be ruined pretty quickly if the shadows are going the wrong way. It just doesn't work as well. So, and I'm not saying that I get that 100% right. Maybe I don't even get that 50% right, but that's my goal as I'm working, is how are those shadows being cast? The skin raises up just a little bit. What happens to the light? I mean, is it a pillow emboss? Is it just a deep embossed? I mean, how does that work, And just finishing up, getting those little black areas above the teeth finished. And at some point, I've got to get back to the eyes here and figure out what I want to do with the eyes. I wasn't sure if I wanted to add pupils to it, or I just wanted to have, the whites of his eyes showing, or, the yellow and the reds that he has on his eyes without the pupils and the iris. But I sort of decide, yeah, I think it'd be nice to have some eyeballs. Give him a little bit more personality. So just drawing those in. Now, typically when I work, I like to get the eyes first, because to me that sets the tone for the piece. I like to get the details and the highlights, everything first on the eyes. Just kind of gives me some inspiration, direction for the rest of the piece, saying, man, it looks good, it's detailed, it's real shiny and wet looking, and I carry that aesthetic through the rest of my piece as I work. but for some reason I started going, well, I guess not for some reason, I just wasn't sure what I was going to do at this point, so I kind of waited to the last minute. So here's a little blender pen. I'm fixing a little mistake. I got some black inside the eye, or some gray inside the iris itself, which will eventually be orange and yellow, so I just wanted to push that ink back out. I use the blenders as an eraser a lot. If you have a color that you've gone over the line with, you can use your blender to push it back away. It'll spread it away from the line. So I use that quite a bit. Here I'm starting to block on the red. I think I'm using a R24, which is kind of like an orange red. But again, I'm starting to think about, what does my highlights look like? The lightest shades of red that I'm going to have besides the highlights will be my base color, and I'll start adding on top of it, because you should always go light to dark when it comes to markers. A tattoo, it's the opposite, but in ink markers, that's the direction you want to go. Now I'm going really fast, being careful not to take my black ink and smudge it into my red, which I've done a few times here, but I'm going to put a lot of texture on this, so it's just going to add to the texture. That's my excuse anyway. But I'm being loose with this, and you can see there's a lot of white space kind of showing through that red. And that's okay, because I'll use that to my advantage later on once I start highlighting. You know, you don't want to color this like a coloring book per se and have it, you know, everything so evenly filled, because it just doesn't look organic. So having those base layers kind of messy adds to the illusion of texture. So here I'm using an R27 or an R29, I'm not sure. So I'm just using that to give a little bit more depth on the left side of his face, because that is the shaded side. Again, trying to be loose, not worrying about, you know, the color being super smooth and super flat, because I want that texture to be, you know, layer number 2 at this point, but I want multiple layers of kind of crisscrossy, messy texture. I think that's not a technical term, but I'm going to stick with it. Here, thinking about where the shading will be even on the light side of the face, because even though you have a light source coming, there's still going to be less light around the edges and around the curves. And I'm blending those a little bit more smooth. Starting to see a little bit more dimension here. Now I'm taking this up into an R44, somewhere in there. It's a little bit more of a maroon shade. I'm getting more into the gray tones inside the red itself. I'll go back in with my previous layered red and take some of the gray purple tones from that marker, from the maroon marker, and bring it back into my red family. And now I'm going in with my grays and laying the dark grays over the red. And I always go back and lay more red over the gray, just to keep the neutral gray on the red side of the family, and kind of blend them together a little bit. I don't want too hard edges over those soft curves. You can see here I'm just using some cross hatching. I tend to shift from different types of shading and texture techniques as I do what I do, and where I'm at right now is I just like to see a lot of hatching. I think hatching is a nice illusion. It's kind of interesting to look at. It doesn't look like I'm trying to be a photocopier and copy every single pockmark in the skin. This just looks more or less refined this way with cross-hatching. It looks a little bit more cartoonish. Yeah, just kind of where I'm at right now. Working on the eyes with colored pencil. It's a lot of detail in a small, tiny little space. So just switching over to the nice little small tips of a colored pencil and blend those together. And I think it'll look all right. You'll also notice that the white part of the eyes are not actually white. I think they are a lot darker than you realize. You know, if you stand in, you know, a house that's relatively dark and you look at somebody in the eyes, you almost can't even see the whites of the eyes. They're set back, they're dark, which on the flip side really makes the highlights of the eyes, you know, stand out. So I like to make the whites of the eyes really dark, and as I go forward in this piece, you'll see that I'll darken them even darker than, yeah, there we go right there. I'm using an N5, so that's 50% black on the whites of the eyes, and it seems crazy, but when I start adding highlights, it'll really, really bring out the circular form of the eye. You know, those brow bones are pretty heavy, so it casts a pretty dark shadow over those eyes. Again, it's all about the illusion, right? There you go. You're starting to see those highlights on the whites of the eyes, and the eyelids kind of collect that water from the eye itself, and it really gives you some good contrast. So here I'm using a colored pencil, and I'm just kind of throwing some lines, not quite hatching because they're single direction lines, but I'm throwing lines in the direction of the form of the bones that are underneath that skin, just to show where the shadows are. And there's a little bit of hatching there. Doing the same thing with the black pencil here. But I want that whole layer to be based on lines. So you get the contours, and the shading is along those contours rather than just me shading and blending flat. You know, I want you to see those lines. That gives you good texture. That colored pencil right there is called Crimson Lake. I think it's a 926 by Prismacolor. I could be wrong, but it is one of my favorite colored pencils. I have about a dozen of those sitting in my drawer. I use them for so many different things. Here we start getting into the horns and the teeth. I think I'm using a Y23 or a Y21 at this point. They're just kind of a very off shade of yellow, not very bright yellow, and I think it's a good base for dirty teeth or horns. I use it a lot. I like it. Blends really well with my E colors, which are my browns. They just complement each other very well, so I think there's an E25. My screen's really small, so I can't exactly see what markers I was using, but it's somewhere in there. Again, trying to use line work as texture, even with my markers. Not being too worried about where those lines are laid. There's no mistakes when you're doing something so organic like, you know, the ridges of a horn. Just let them go where they go. Don't overthink it. Same thing with teeth. You know, teeth aren't exactly flat. They have ridges to them and contours that are just minute. So let the pens just go where they want to go. That's the trick behind it, is not having a trick, right? You know, this isn't a blueprint. It's not a machine drafting, you know, of a machine part. It should be organic and free-flowing and loose. And here we start the highlighting phase, and this is a white polychromos pencil. I think this is where the art starts to take form. You know, when you have an object that's just sitting in the dark, you can't really tell the shape of it. You really can't tell the contours of a piece, but when you know, shine a light onto it or a flashlight onto it, whatever it is, and all of a sudden your eye understands the entire object. You can tell where it's coming towards you, where it's dipping away. It's all about the highlights. And again, I'm not just smudging highlights onto the paper. I'm trying to use lines of contour to tell me where, or to tell your eyes where the shape is going. So not only am I telling you where the light is shining onto it, but I'm telling you this is where I want your eyes to follow the contour of this shape. So it's just a really fun technique. It's, you know, a comic style, but it also keeps it, again, like I said before, not being a copy of a photograph, you know, where I'm trying to mimic everything from a photograph. I'm trying to give you an illusion here, but also have fun artistically with it. And it's just something that I'm exploring, and maybe I'll look at it a year down the road and say, geez, why was I doing that? It's just terrible looking, but that's just where I'm at right now, and I'm having fun with it, and hope you guys are having fun too. You can see that I'm putting lines where the red and the black meet, and I'm trying to give you the illusion that maybe that black was carved in. You know, if it was tattooed on, there wouldn't be that ridge there. That's what you'd call a pillow emboss, where, you know, there's a little valley in between two sections, and that little section, of course, where the two colors meet, if there's a dip in there, there should be a shine on the edge of that. There's just those couple little lines around the eyes and around the quote-unquote tattooed areas of the black on the forehead, which just gives you the illusion that it's carved in. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be in the right exact spot. I just put a few lines here and there, and your eyes will fill in the rest of that information and say, yep, there's a dip there. And that's it. That's the trick. Get some more highlights in those tear ducts, because there's always water sitting in those tear ducts. So you should have some light refraction hitting there. And having some rim lighting here on the horns, because you know the light's coming from the left side of the screen here, the right side of the illustration. There's still maybe light bouncing off of the ground or off of the right wall, you know, reflecting it back onto the darkest side of this piece. Here I'm adding in some hot spots, and you can see I'm using my finger to diffuse some of those hot spots, and at that point right there I'm coloring on my fingertip and using that to dab some of the jelly ink onto the paper itself, giving it some texture. Here's the signature, and that means I'm finished. Hope you guys enjoyed.